The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were named after Italian Renaissance.
No. I gotta fix this. I don't even care. Hate me all you want, Wyatt. Come on, Professor. I know it's not you. I know it's the editor. Strangle him. Simple. I'm not asking for any... Come on. Give me a break. Like, for example, this is a nice piece of information that he's sharing. I appreciate that.
Now, if you go to the Louvre, you might be disappointed that...
But what disappoints me is that it is in the Louvre. It should be in Italy. It should be in freaking Florence.
Leonardo painted androgynous, or we might say gender fluid, young men because of the importance of beauty in a patriarchal world. For many women...
Historian answers Renaissance questions, tech support, Wyatt. I love the Renaissance. There is so much that can be said, particularly when it comes to armor. I know that people think of art, but armor is art as well as it's martial art. You could think about it that way. So yeah, I'm really excited to see. I hope it's a good professor. I hope it's not one of those that pushes politics. Just give me the history, right? Just give me the history. We got a little Mona Lisa in the background, Leonardo da Vinci. Let's see what we've got. Let's go. Hit me with this, with the facts.
I'm historian Alex Bevilacqua. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Renaissance support.
Bevilacqua. Bevilacqua, it's an Italian surname. It means drink the water. That's what it means. Drink water. So let's do it. Bevilacqua, we need to do it. Let's beviamo l'acqua, dai. Un po' d'acqua per te. Okay? We got the water. Let's go. With that out of the way. Teach me, Professor.
A question from the Ask Historian subreddit. Seriously though, what actually is the Renaissance? The European Renaissance is a period in history when scholars and artists rediscovered culture of classical antiquity, of ancient...
I love how they that is, okay, Wired editor. That is a great way to provide censorship, which shouldn't even exist since this is art, but it's a great way to provide censorship.
Greece and Rome. Then they created art that was inspired by the pagan past. And while the Renaissance began in Italy, it soon spread all over Europe. This was also a period, however, of political instability. Italy itself was fragmented. And so the Renaissance is also a period of warfare and great violence.
I need to make some videos on the condottieri, probably, since we are on this item of conversation.
Technologies such as artillery were transforming the battlefield, and new ideas such as the ideas of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation were fragmenting Europe and causing new forms of division and conflict. From the history...
Oh yeah, I mean, Protestants versus Catholics is a conflict, all right. He was referring to the Romans and the Greeks, that's why he said pagan. But I mean, it's true. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. So one thing that is fascinating about, let me see if I can get the frame when he said that, because there is one thing I wanted to say. Apologies if this brings you back. There we go. So one thing I wanted to say is that it's true. It's inspired by the classical period. I mean, from their point of view, of course, the Renaissance artists wouldn't look at it this way. They wouldn't be like, we're looking at the pagan past. For them, they are pagans, in fact, heathens. These are Christian artists, but I think they looked at it, because they looked at it in a positive way, I think they looked at it as being inspired by classical period, classical antiquity, and the beautiful aspects of classical antiquity. Yet, even though the statues, for instance, David, most famous one, of course, even though the statues are absolutely made in the style, they did make them all white in the Renaissance. So you will see this, but in ancient Rome, this would have been fully painted instead. And so it's so interesting that when you see a all-white statue like this in a video game that is supposed to be set, or a movie that is supposed to be set in the past, if it's set in the Renaissance, it would be okay. But if it's set in ancient Rome, then no, they should be in full color. I thought that was fascinating to talk about.
We have, what event marks the beginning of the Renaissance?
Good luck with that.
Great question. For this one, I'm going to need my trusty timeline. Because the Renaissance is a cultural and intellectual movement, it is hard to pinpoint a single date on which it started. In 1345, the poet Francesco Petrarch, goes to the Verona Cathedral Library and discovers a forgotten manuscript of Cicero, the ancient orator, and this starts the race to recover other manuscripts of classical antiquity. In 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire, and a new era begins in the Middle East. It's also when we have the development of movable type and of the printing press. In 1492, Columbus makes his first journey to the Americas. And in 1498, the Portuguese explorer...
He sounds like a very kind person. Does it give you that feeling as well? Anyways, one thing I wanted to notice, he must be of Italian. This is obviously his surname is Italian. Maybe speaks Italian, because the way he pronounced the name of the poet, he said, and I repeat it exactly, Francesco Petrarca. That is how we pronounce it in Italy, but I'm noticing that he's doing it in a way that usually natives do. So he's closing the E, Francesco Petrarca. Not all people pronounce it like that in Italy, but there are a lot of regions that do. And in standard Italian, you're supposed to pronounce it like a E as opposed to a E. But foreigners usually don't know that. So the fact that he did that I think he speaks Italian.
Or Vasco da Gama arrives in India. And in 1517, Martin Luther makes his protest against the Catholic Church in his 95 Theses, which set off the Protestant Reformation. In 1599, the Globe Theatre in London is built, where Shakespeare staged many of his most important plays. When we periodize history, we usually say that with the end of the 16th century, the Renaissance era ends and the Baroque period begins. By the time we get to the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618, which is a conflict that involves all of Europe, we're definitely not in the Renaissance anymore. Gata Graceful says, "Why is the Mona Lisa so popular? I literally don't give a f***. She's ugly."
I didn't know that the DAGF.
First of all, rude. To think of the Mona Lisa as the equivalent of a Renaissance pinup is the wrong way of approaching this painting. Leonardo's portrait of this wife of a Florentine silk merchant is one he worked on for much of his life. The Del Giocondo family who had commissioned it never actually received the painting, which was found in his atelier in France. The Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in history. So why is that? I'm going to give you two reasons. One has to do with Leonardo's technique, which is known as sfumato. He layered glaze over glaze over glaze so that all of the different colors blend.
That means smoked. Sfumato. Well, sort of. Not exactly, no. It's like, I need to give you a good translation now because I don't want to give you the wrong one. So let me look for that. But because fumo means smoke, so sfumatura, it's like when you do the different layers. But the origin, the etymological origin of the word does come from it, because smoke does, is denser and then less dense and less dense. That's where it comes from. But still, how do you say sfumato in English? Blurred, I guess. But the origin is, because I kind of want to show you the screen. So Google Translate, which usually is excellent, by the way, they must have updated it because now it does a very good job at translating even entire sentences. Sfumato translates as blurred, which is what it means. But if you see, if I write fumo, it's smoke. So clearly that's the origin of the term. Back to the professor. So far, I like him.
Into each other so that there's no trace of the brushwork. Of course, this painting is completed after he's done his studies of anatomy, so he understands how the musculature of the lower face works. When he gives her that mysterious half smile, it's deliberate. Leonardo has his sitter almost completely still. She's immobile, and yet she's bursting with life. All we want to know is what she's thinking, and that is the power of Leonardo's portraiture, that he can convey so much interiority with so little motion. Now, if you go to the Louvre, you might be disappointed that you won't get a close encounter with a Mona Lisa.
Oh no, that's not what disappoints me, my friend, Mr. Bevilacqua. What disappoints me is that it is in the Louvre. It should be in Italy. It should be in freaking Florence. That's where it belongs.
Because she is so popular. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., you can have an encounter with the first woman that Leonardo portrayed, Ginevra de' Benci, and you can have her probably all to yourself. Ginevra de' Benci called herself a mountain tiger. She was the original ice queen, as you can tell by looking at this painting. And getting to see it up close is one of the pleasures of the National Gallery. You can see Leonardo's brushwork, for example, the beautiful way in which the pearl hovers over her chest as it buttons together.
It almost seems 3D. Did you see that? That's insane. Leonardo da Vinci. What a man. Man, that's crazy. It looks 3D. That's crazy.
Together her very fine blouse. The Nintendo creator asks, what were common people's diets like in Renaissance-era Europe? Their diets were pretty terrible.
Yep.
The diet of an ordinary person would really have been based around a staple crop. In Europe, it was mostly wheat that would give them the calories they needed.
Yeah, that's not terrible. That sounds great to me, Professor.
to get through the day. And this they would have eaten in the form of bread or perhaps gruel, which is a kind of porridge made with old bread. So not very exciting, not very delicious. Even the rich people were not eating many of the things that we consider characteristic of European cuisine. For example, the tomato is...
Of course, because, yeah, I mean, tomato is brought back from America, so you've got to wait for the Europeans to relocate to said America, of course, to bring it back, as the professor is correctly pointing out. Interestingly enough, the original tomatoes that were brought back to Europe, and then, of course, Italians, finally, we got fixated, and that's all we eat, and literally my blood is diluted tomato. With that being said, initially, the medieval Europeans thought it could have been poisonous. The original one, some of the original species were definitely smaller. This is something that already starts to get grown artificially, and some of the variety was yellow.
It's one of the many products that came from the Americas and that was not available in Renaissance Europe. So what even is Italian food without the tomato? Likewise, peppers, corn, squashes, avocados, also pineapples, and most depressingly, perhaps, cacao. So no chocolate in Renaissance Europe. In addition to this, something that is essential to many of us, coffee, was not yet known in Europe. So all of the achievements of the Renaissance, they were all achieved without caffeine. Eventually...
It is a great way to look at it. I like that. But I do disagree. I don't think that, since we're going into a little bit the idea of culinary past, I think that first of all, the food would have been much better than today when it comes to everything was seasonal. Nothing had the freaking plastics and chemicals and all the stuff that is bad for you that we put in it. And I still think, though, I mean, fish, for instance, you could literally, even as a lower person, depending on where you're from, if you're near a river, you could fish salmon and eat it. Usually you have to pay taxes because the land belongs to the Lord, whatever. There were taxes for everything in the medieval period. But I mean, you know, you can make a nice salmon, you can roast it and then create a little pesto or a little green sauce with some vegetables in your pestle and mortar and then cover it up. It's good. I don't believe this idea that if you were poor or during a famine or during war, then 100% we are on the same page. 100%. But in everyday life of medieval people, upper and lower class, as long as it was a period of relative success with the crops not failing and all that, I think the food would have been pretty good.
However, these goods start to trickle in and they start to decorate the tables of, by the end of the 16th century, of elite households. And in 17th century art, we see many beautiful still life paintings that depict all of these rich and wonderful agricultural products that are...
Sorry to interrupt him again, but this is such a good opportunity. Do you see this image? Of course, we're seeing a pineapple, once again, a fruit that you don't find in Europe until we get to, you know, actually explore America with the European ships, and then we bring back the stuff. Did you hear about the idea of a pineapple already being in ancient Rome? Which is, of course, nonsense, but it's always funny to see it. Look at this. Pineapple in ancient Rome. Dun, dun, dun! The pineapple in ancient Rome. And so, yeah, there are people that literally made YouTube videos. I'm not joking. Seriously saying maybe the Romans reached America, got a pineapple and somehow brought it back. Or I guess starting to plant them. I mean, bringing it back is not impossible. You can bring back the seeds, clearly. But that, yeah, they were saying that that's it and that's nonsense. This isn't a pineapple. It's a pine cone. This is a pine cone. And the green that you see is from some asparagus behind it.
Still life paintings that depict all of these rich and wonderful agricultural products that are coming into Europe from all over the world.
Nice.
The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were named after Italian Renaissance.
Just realized that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were named after Italian Renaissance artists. Absolutely. Also, capital letter for Italian.
That's right. Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, and
Leonardo. No, you missed me. Sorry. No, I gotta fix this. I don't even care. Hey, no, you want Wired. I literally have not even one F to give. 1 second. These are Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Come on, Professor. I know it's not you. I know it's the editor. Strangle him. Simple. I'm not asking for Come on. Give me a break.
Donatello is slightly earlier than the others and was a sculptor. Michelangelo is both a sculptor and the painter of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael is an exquisite painter who's a contemporary of Michelangelo's. And Leonardo da Vinci, of course, everyone knows as a painter, a draftsman, an engineer.
So I love Raffaello's paintings the most. And I'm a little biased because it is my name, Raffaello. Exactly like the painter, because in Italy, in Italian, there are two ways to render the name Raphael in English, or Raphael in the original Hebrew, which means God heals. One is Raffaele, which is the more common, and it's not the way of him. And the other one is Raffaello, which is a lot less common, and that's my name. So I have the same name as the painter.
Is an exquisite painter who's a contemporary of Michelangelo's. And Leonardo da Vinci, of course, everyone knows as a painter, a draftsman, an engineer. Aristocrati from Reddit asks, is it true that during the Renaissance, some women used belladonna in their eyes for a dilated, attractive effect? Belladonna is a highly toxic plant that was used in the Renaissance, not so much to dilate the pupils as to make the complexion paler. Women in the Renaissance were obsessed with having pale skin, and they used a variety of means to make their skin more fair. Some of these were highly toxic, including lead, mercury sublimate, and arsenic. They also bleached their hair because of the importance of beauty in a patriarchal world. For many women, their marriage prospects were one of the most important determinants of their lives because of the importance of beauty in a patriarchal world.
I'm sorry, Professor, but I fail to understand what makeup and women has to do with the patriarchy. Women love makeup. If anything, even today, if we really have to make a comparison in this case, it's not men that make women put on makeup. In fact, I want to say, and I'm pretty confident about this, you can do a poll right now and 90% of men will say, no, I prefer women without makeup, or maybe a little touch of lipstick and that's it. It's women that like to put on full faces of makeup, and that's the reality. It has nothing to do with the patriarchy today, and in the medieval period or the Renaissance even less, because in the classical period women did put on more makeup, but in the medieval period makeup was, even when it comes to like traditional values and even what the church was saying about it, it was supposed to not be exaggerated for a matter of modesty, for a matter of more simplistic values and approaches to the idea of a woman. So no, I strongly disagree with this. Makeup on women is not because of patriarchy. Men do not make women put on makeup. Nonsense.
When we laugh at them for these efforts, we shouldn't assume that they were always unaware of the side effects.
I don't really laugh at them, to be honest, Professor. I mean, I understand them. I'm being picky because I'm Mr. Pedantic here. So I assume you mean when some people laugh at them, which, sure. I'll do that, okay? So I don't strawman the man. Bella donna, which actually means beautiful woman. Maybe explains it.
The products that they used. And there are indeed some examples of women poisoning their husbands with their cosmetics, showing that they were extremely able both to understand that these were toxic chemicals and to put them to lethal use. At Foster Hunter Art asks, what hidden message does Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper hold? The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci is a fresco that is found in Milan on a wall of the dining hall of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Many people have read the Da Vinci Code and have developed conspiracy theories about this painting. Specifically, they think that the Apostle John, the youngest apostle, who's seated to the right of Jesus Christ, is actually a secret depiction of the Mary Magdalene. This is nonsense. The fact that John looks slightly androgynous is actually entirely characteristic of Leonardo's art. Leonardo painted androgynous, or we might say gender fluid, young men throughout his entire career. There's no coded message there. But there's a lot to love about this painting. For one, the use of linear perspective, the ability to make a flat surface seem like it has spatial depth. And this is something that was not practiced in medieval art, but he makes very elegant use of it here by centering all of the spatial lines in the painting on the face of Jesus Christ.
Man, that's amazing. What a painting. I need to see if I can find, some sort of poster of this. I would totally put it on a wall.
Because this was painted on a large wall and Leonardo had to keep track of the design, he actually used a nail in the center of the face of Jesus Christ, and there's still a trace of it. He chooses a specific and very dramatic moment to depict, which is the moment immediately after Christ has said, "One of you will betray me." And what we see is the extraordinary psychological shock that ripples through the group of the apostles as they process this information. All of their different responses expressed with their hand gestures, except, of course, for Judas, who is leaning forward knowingly. The movements of the body convey the movements of the soul.
That's like environmental storytelling, but Renaissance version, isn't it?
OGSSX asks, if social media existed in different historical eras, which period would have the spiciest posts? My money's on the Renaissance. The Renaissance is an age of rivalry, first and foremost between different princes, between the courtiers who are competing for their favor at court. It's also an age of rivalry in the arts. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo famously did not get along when they were commissioned to paint two different walls in the same room in the center of Florence. So you can imagine how that went. The Medici are a family of merchants who become wealthy.
Once again, his Italian pronunciation is spot on.
Bankers, they're bankers to the Pope. They sponsor a lot of artists. And Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent in particular, is famous for living like a Renaissance prince. One of the artists who worked for Lorenzo, for example, was Sandro Botticelli, who's famous for The Birth of Venus. Zerthezer says, can you all art people explain to me why of all the great Sandro Botticellis, it's The Birth of Venus that seems to grasp pop culture by the neck? Weird. Well,
one question mark is enough, by the way.
It's true that there are many great paintings by Sandro Botticelli, but I think there's good reason that The Birth of Venus is one of the most famous. It is quite a sexy painting. So most of Botticelli's earlier paintings are religious scenes, Virgin Marys, and other saints. So this turn to pagan subjects really marks a change in the history of art. Venus is the ancient pagan Roman goddess of love, and she's emerging, according to myth, out of the waters, fully formed and being welcomed by a gentle breeze. In Renaissance Florence, there were sometimes debates about how much nudity was appropriate to be displayed in public places. So a painting like this would definitely have been for the inner rooms of a palace where only a select number of people would have been able to view it. At H. Lanella Tanda says, just realized, next question. At Yaboy DLG says, more important to mankind, Johannes Gutenberg or Steve Gutenberg? No shade to Steve Gutenberg, but I'm going to go with Johannes here. Johannes Gutenberg is associated with one of the most important technological breakthroughs in Renaissance Europe, the printing press. Here is a small-scale model of a Gutenberg press. Printing had been known in China for centuries, but it was block printing. It wasn't printing with movable type. So the key breakthrough here is having different characters for each letter made out of lead that can be recombined. And this makes it much more economical to produce many, many pages of text in a short time. And of course, the abundance of paper, which again is a Chinese technology that becomes increasingly common in Europe. Paper is made by pulping old rags. It's made of underpants, if you will, and it's much cheaper than the animal hides on which people wrote earlier in the Middle Ages. The press itself is modeled on a wine press. This is where we would put the piece of paper, fasten it so that it doesn't move. Here, we would screw together all of our type so that it stays tight. Then we would place it and we would ink it. Using ink balls, it would be covered with the viscous ink and then rolled here under the press. And then the strongest man in the print shop would screw it down and make an impression of a page.
You know what I think? What this is kind of telling me about the way Wired functions, because this is why every time I kind of want to click and see. A bit like I do with History Hit. Sometimes they make videos and I'm like, this is nonsense. And other times they make videos which is like, this is pretty good. And then you've got the, this is good, bad type of videos. I believe they must send him the questions in advance because there's no way, why would he have brought this otherwise? I think what they do is that they send it with nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying, oh, look, he already, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just curious as to how this works. Because I imagine they're paid for what they're doing. and they must get the answers, the questions in advance. So my question is, do they have to reply with the answers in advance? Because Wired can be very, very political sometimes. They can be very politically correct, let's put it this way. You have to say this, you have to say that. So I wonder if some of the words that are used are because of a script that has been accepted. Maybe not. Okay, I'm just sharing it. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but it is a massive, Wired is a massive channel. But anyway, so far I like the history. So.
And this process can be repeated again and again so that you can make many impressions of a single page. The very first book to be made with this new combination of technologies is Gutenberg's Bible. It imitates a medieval manuscript book in every possible way, including that they've had someone by hand decorate the
yeah, look at this. Like, for example, this is a nice piece of information that he's sharing. I appreciate that. Look at this. This is, wow. And it's printed. Should you imagine that?
Letters. In the 50 years from the invention of the printing press, some 6 million books were produced in Europe in about 40,000 editions, which is probably more books than had been produced in Europe in the preceding millennium. One of the many effects of the printing press can be seen in the Protestant Reformation, which, starting with Luther's theses of 1517, relied on the ability of reformers to print out their ideas and to distribute them quickly. It almost became a form of Renaissance social media. Without the existence...
That's a very good way to put it. That's a very good way to put it. A form of Renaissance social media.
Of print, it's hard to imagine that the new ideas of the Reformation would have traveled as widely or reached as many people as they did. At Wonder Boy Genius asks, wait, was MLK named after Martin Luther? Actually, yes. Martin Luther King Jr.'s father traveled to Germany as a Baptist pastor and was so inspired by what he learned about Martin Luther that he changed his own name and he changed his 5-year-old son's name as well. And it's not difficult to see why a Baptist preacher of the 20th century might have been inspired by the figure of the 16th century Augustinian friar that stood up to the Roman Catholic Church. Luther's Reformation came from a very deep spiritual insight, which is that works, that is good deeds, charitable deeds, are not what leads to salvation. It's faith that leads to salvation. And that undermines the whole edifice of pilgrimage and of indulgences and all of these ways in which late medieval Christianity was telling people that they could get to heaven. Luther...
Of course, it's a very watered down, simplistic description of the core doctrinal differences between the Protestant movement and Catholicism. But sure, I mean, he didn't have much time, I guess, to go into the details of that.
Luther's initial intention was to change the church from within, not to break from it. Over the course of the 3 years after he first published his criticisms in 1517, he realized that schism was inevitable. And this great division between Catholics and, as they were called by their critics, Protestants, led to wars of religion that lasted almost 150 years. At Vinbrow...
Even longer than that. I mean, Irish Catholics versus English Protestants.
Brown asks, what's with the sea monsters on old maps? If you've ever looked at a Renaissance map such as this one, you'll have noticed figures of fantastical sea monsters. The first thing to consider is that these maps were not made for navigators. These are maps for people who like to imagine distant places. So part of the function of the sea monsters is to make these maps beautiful.
We should have never stopped that. Literally, I want that on my maps. Back. Bring them all back, I say.
Monsters also tell us about ideas people had. The monstrous was a category of thought where people dumped things that they couldn't otherwise explain. This is a map of the Caribbean and of coastal South America. The people of the Americas were of extreme interest to Europeans. The Tupinamba people of Brazil were depicted here wearing feathers and engaging in an act of cannibalism because Europeans heard that cannibalism was practiced in Brazil. And this became one of their most enduring obsessions, even in relative absence of evidence of this practice. At JTalk says, OMG, the Sistine Chapel is unbelievable. A human did that? No way. Many individuals collaborated together to make this splendid...
Glorious
place of worship in St. Peter's in Rome. Of course, the most famous is Michelangelo, who painted the ceiling and the back wall. Michelangelo was a sculptor, and he was initially skeptical when approached by Pope Julius II, one of the great Renaissance popes, to paint the ceiling. He wasn't sure he wanted to invest that much time into this endeavor. He was famous in his time for his sculpture, including the David facing Goliath, depicted as a handsome youth, and that you can still visit in Florence. Eventually, Michelangelo was persuaded, and he painted a ceiling with scenes from Genesis that is still one of the most astonishing ceiling paintings that you can see anywhere, and that immediately sent out ripples through Renaissance Rome as other artists came to admire this work.
Not to mention, this is the most famous Adam and God extending his hand and finger towards mankind. It's a beautiful representation. I really like the fact that in this, because it's nice that you can try to look at the way it is an expression of the author's mind and culture. And I love the fact that look how God is trying to reach man. I really love that detail of it.
Most famous section of the painting is at center. It's God creating Adam. Michelangelo suffered a lot to make this ceiling. He was up on a scaffolding. It used to be thought that he lay on his back, but we actually have a doodle that Michelangelo did in the margin of a letter to a friend in which he shows himself standing upright painting. Several decades later, in a very different political climate, he was brought back by a different pope to paint the back wall. That's when he created the Last Judgment, which is an extraordinary scene filled with hundreds.
But look at all the colors. This is why it pisses me off whenever Hollywood covers medieval people in brown and gray. Now, I understand this is not necessarily a scene of the Middle Ages, but it is made by medieval people, and this is how we should imagine medieval Italy, medieval Rome, medieval Florence, with people wearing all sorts of different colors. Of course, the availability of certain colors would be dependent on how much money you had, 100%. But then again, there were cheaper versions. Like, for example, blue, even in ancient Rome, you had a cheap blue and you had an expensive blue. So blue depends, right? The purple was the one that was almost impossible for people to buy. But even, and then green could be expensive because you needed to first dye it yellow and then dye it again to reach green. But apart from these details, colors would have been everywhere, both in the classical period and in the medieval period.
Hundreds of bodies. One detail that's worth noticing in the Last Judgment is St. Bartholomew holding his own flayed skin, because that skin is thought to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo. Jessica from Reddit asks, in a Renaissance era world, what resource would be really important in trading and worth fighting for? You might think of gold or ivory, but the one that maybe is most important to consider is spices. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper from the Malabar coast, the south coast of India, cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. These were things that could not be produced in Europe and that had to be imported at great expense. They were transported across the Indian Ocean by Muslim merchants. When in the 15th century, the Portuguese start sailing along the coast of Africa and eventually reach India by 1498. One of the main reasons for their journey is to disrupt the spice trade, to cut out the middleman, the Muslim middleman, and to make themselves masters of this trade, which indeed they managed to do, and which leads to a period of Portuguese domination of the high seas. And
man, the Portuguese weren't messing around. I like playing the Portuguese whenever they are available in any strategy game.
Global trade that connects Europe all the way to Japan. In order to be able to do this, the Portuguese had to make breakthroughs in open sea navigation. Vasco da Gama sailed out into the open ocean in order to be brought back by the currents. And that is also how the Europeans first ended up in Brazil, when they sailed out a little too far off the coast of Africa. This is the context for Columbus's voyage in 1492 and his subsequent ones. And of course, it begins a new era of colonialism.
Renaissance hygiene. Yeah, let me see the hygiene part. I want to see what he says about that.
14 asks, was Renaissance European hygiene really as bad as some say, and everyone walked around very unclean and smelly? This is a slightly unfair picture of the Renaissance world. People cared a lot about beautiful scents. They bought expensive perfumes, and they sought even exotic goods that would give them pleasant sensations. And the reason this was important was because they believed that disease could be transmitted through something called a miasma, essentially a bad smell. So smell was very important in the Renaissance because it conveyed information. It told you, is something healthy or unhealthy? The wealthy could surround themselves with fragrant gardens and have a much more fragrant lifestyle.
To add to that, you know what medieval people had? Something that they had already invented? Let's put it this way. Water. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, medieval people went to freaking rivers and bathhouses, in fact. Even the lower classes. So yeah, I would remove the slightly part. And I mean, yeah, of course you would have had also people who stink. We've got people who stink today. We've got all sorts of soaps available, and you haven't had a shower in 3 days. You watching this video. Of course, if you did it, it's very likely that someone in the Middle Ages also did that. But because we're talking about in general, the general population in general, no, they weren't all like dirty and disgusting and all that. Because who wants to do? It's not even a matter of, yeah, but they didn't know about bacteria. It doesn't matter. You don't need to know about bacteria to know that it's not pleasant. It's nice to bathe. Shakespeare, was he real? Who asked that? Oh my gosh. Before dentistry. Yeah, I guess we can finish with dentistry.
Here's a question from the Ask Historians subreddit. Did people before the age of modern dentistry all have bad teeth? In the Renaissance, people cared about having beautiful teeth about as much as we do today. There were no dentists, however, in the Renaissance. If you needed a tooth pull, you went to your neighborhood barber, who was also your surgeon. The era before modern anesthesia, the best surgeon is the fastest surgeon, and the best dentist is the one who can pull your aching tooth the fastest. And
I would drink something really strong, to be honest. If that were the case, I would drink I would get drunk.
causing you the least amount of pain. Having said that, already in antiquity, people were making dentures and bridges to improve people's smiles and hide the gaps in their teeth. So too in the Renaissance, the barber surgeon Ambroise Paré, for example, makes a set of dentures for the French King Charles IX out of gold and silver.
Very cool. Anyways, yeah, I liked the presentation. It wasn't a lot of interesting information, I've got to say. A couple of words that I was like, I don't know why he put them in there. That's why I'm saying maybe Wyatt asked him to do it. But regardless of that, it's I can't complain. You know me, when I do find those that piss me off, I say it, and I have absolutely no shame in saying what I think. But you know, the information was good. Whoever watched this, I think, you know, the information was pretty good. What did you guys think?